Oh, hello. I was just reading a wonderful book called History of Western Society. I just finished a chapter about expanding thought in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. I'll give you a brief synopsis. It all started with the scientific revolution, during which scientists such as Copernicus, Brahe, Galileo, and Isaac Newton made breakthroughs in astronomy and physics, thus changing the entire face of science, and demolishing the theories of Aristotle and Christian theology. As these new developments occurred in the scientific world, ideas such as the scientific method led to voices of thought and reason in the intellectual world. Thus, the Enlightenment was born. Philosophers, based mainly in France, used critical thinking to develop ideas of freedom and equality, which led to change in government. Absolute monarchs of the time, such as Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II, Maria Theresa of Austria, and Frederick II of Prussia, became enlightened monarchs who brought reforms in their countries based on these ideas. However, the refinement of the mind was mostly only changing the upper classes. Common people still lived much like their ancestors of the Middle Ages. They worked extremely hard to produce very little. Life was a struggle. This brings me to the chapter I am just about to start, the age of the agricultural revolution. The European economy was just beginning to spring back, population was beginning to grow, and the colonial empires were beginning to be expanded. What followed was the inevitable agricultural revolution. But as much as I love reading textbooks, I think the best way to learn history is to experience it for yourself. So let's go back to the 18th century. Oh, hello there. My name is Sister Wendy, and today, unfortunately, we will not be discussing the lockout. Instead, we will be discussing the wonderful agricultural revolution. Let's backtrack to the 1700s to the medieval century. So, one of the greatest achievements of medieval agriculture was the open field system. This divided the land into large fields, which were then cut up into long, narrow strips. The land was left unfenced. An avid peasant man.
When the soil would become exhausted, after years of constant planting, the nitrogen of the soil would deplete, and the crops would fail. There was an insufficient amount of manure, so the peasants were forced to leave the land fallow for a duration of time. However, they were able to establish free irrigation in a uniform system. There would be a year of wheat or rye, then a year of oats or beans, then a year of fallow.
Also means common land. Common lands were open meadows for natural pasture and hay. They were mostly set aside for grass horses and oxen, but were also occupied by the cows and pigs of the community. After the harvest, peasants of the village would pasture animals on the wheat or rye stubble. Now, how about we meet a poor peasant woman? Before pasturing, however, poor woman like me would go through the fields and pick up fallen grain from the harvest. It was backbreaking work, but almond kept some from starving in the winter years. Labor and tax system in Western Europe was harsh, but it was the Eastern peasants that suffered the greatest. Now, let's meet a peasant from Eastern Europe. Notice the beard.
Many limitations to the amount of labor when sent to the farm. There is clothing work 6 days a week without pay. Serfs and serf families are often sold without land.
In Western Europe, peasants had it easier. Most were free from serfdom and even owned land and could pass it to their children. However, things were still bad for most peasants. There is much poverty, and only 10% of peasants could live suitably off of their harvests. They also had to pay harsh royal taxes, tithe to the church, dues to the Lord, and set aside seed for the next season. While peasants lived meagerly, they were actually comparatively well off.
The ruling class wanted enclosed fields because it benefited them. Enclosed fields meant higher crop yields. because of these higher yields, they could charge peasants more for rent. Additionally, the English aristocracy had the ability to invest in new technology. Historians have two contrasting views on the fairness of enclosed fields.
Hey historians, what can you tell me about the cost of enclosure and the fairness of the enclosure movement?
I believe that the fields were split fairly among the large and small landowners, with each getting a proportionate amount to their size.
That would make sense.
I disagree. In reality, the system of enclosure was not very fair. Parliament was controlled by the large landowners who made laws beneficial to themselves. Hundreds of enclosure acts were passed, and which basically meant that the open fields were divided in proportion to the amount of land owned. This seems fair, but the legal and surveying costs were split among the landowners. So, peasants with a small amount of land had to sell their shares to pay for these costs.
How unfair.
Yes.
To put these contrasting views in perspective, half of all the land in England was already enclosed by 1750. So, all the laws passed by Parliament regarding enclosure were just completing what had already been begun. Resulting from enclosure of sheep runs, by the 1700s, for every one independent farmer, there were 2 landless workers. The Enclosure Acts did not change this. After 1830, when all of the enclosure was done, this ratio was very similar. By 1700, a pattern of land ownership and production emerged in England. At one end, there were the landless cottagers, then came the independent farmers, the tenant farmers, and finally the large landowners. Tenant farmers were the ones who really mastered new farming methods. They were paid by large landowners and fenced in fields, built drains, and fertilized the soil. These new techniques led to more job opportunities for landless workers. 2 major themes came out of the 18th century enclosure method. The first theme is a rise in market-oriented estate agriculture. The second theme is the emergence of a new class, landless rural proletariat. These landless workers worked from dawn to dusk 6 days a week. They experienced a loss of independence and self-respect resulting from their loss of common rights and their dependency on cash wages. England experienced the most proletarianization out of all of Europe. Proletarianization is when small farmers become landless rural workers.
Population grew in Europe. The number of rural workers in Europe with little or no land very much increased, so people looked for work in other industries. The cottage industry suited peasants' desires for a profession that included agriculture and other types of work, and urban capitalists were happy to employ them at lower wages than usually commanded.
Honey, I'm home from the market.
Peasants had always flourished by producing their own goods industries. However, during the High Middle Ages, peasants were dominated by merchant and craft guilds. Peasant goods sold very poorly. But when there's too many workers and not enough jobs, the artisan industry was overwhelmed and therefore could not monopolize the production industry.
The cottage industry has also come to be known as the putting out system, because the merchant put out raw materials to several cottage workers, and the workers would then process the raw materials in their own homes. They would then make the materials into a product to be sold, then return it to the merchant. The workers were then paid before the merchant went and sold his goods.
The putting out system was a kind of capitalism. Merchants sought to make money and increase the capital in their businesses. The system grew over time because of the high amount of underemployment in Europe at the time. Peasants and laborers would work for low wages if they could earn money, and in the countryside, workers did not need to meet rigid guild standards. The cottage industry was able to produce all kinds of goods, including textiles, knives, forks, housewares, buttons, and gloves, clocks, and even musical instruments. Apart from everyday articles, luxury goods were also made, but they required special training and close supervision.
The cottage industry first appeared in England, and by 1500, half of England's textiles were being produced in the countryside. In France, under Louis XIV, Colbert had revived the guilds to use them to control the cities and collect taxes. But when rural poverty proved to be too much of a problem, urban manufacturing was severely restricted. Eventually, the government in France even came to believe that the growth of cottage manufacturing was the best way to help the poor in the countryside.
Throughout history until the 19th century, the textile industry has employed the most people, and making textiles was done very often in the putting out system. A typical textile worker lived in a small cottage with tiny windows and a very small amount of space. Usually one room served as a workshop, a bedroom, and a kitchen, and the loom was the most important object in the room. Throughout history, the loom has not changed very much, except when John Kay invented the flying shuttle, which enabled the weaver to throw the shuttle back and forth between the threads with one hand. Apart from the loom, the cottage held spinning wheels, tubs for dyeing cloth and washing wool.
The cottage industry was a family employment, and jobs were shared by all members of a family of all ages. Women and children prepared raw material and spun thread, and the man wove the cloth. Consequently, cottage industry workers were encouraged to marry early and have large families to continue the profession. Skills were taught to children at an early age, and all members of the family worked as a unit.
Constant conflicts between workers of the cottage industry and their employers occurred over the weights of materials, quality of the cloth, and accusations of theft. Cottage workers were difficult to control, and after being paid, they would sometimes not work at all for a couple of days. At the end of the week, these workers would struggle to meet their quota and earn their next pay. During times of high demand for cotton, weavers and their families did well and tended to slack off. After all of these disputes, capitalists looked for ways to improve the efficiency and get more work out of the uncontrollable rural workers.